Welcome everybody to UMSL Global. My name is Eamon Wall. I'm the Smurfit Stone Professor of Irish Studies here on campus, and it is a great pleasure and a privilege to welcome everybody here today. We have a huge crowd of people, which is wonderful. So I'm welcoming people from my world literature class in short stories, and colleagues from the university and from our community, as well as the people on Zoom. And as always, a special thanks to Bob L. of UMSL Global for putting all this event together, and to Leanna Constantine, the executive director of UMSL Global. And we're honored today to have Professor Marty Rochester here, who was one of Tim White's professors when he was a student here at UMSL. And also we have Patricia Zahn, who's the director of the Desley collaborative vision here on campus, and Patrick Sheehan from the Ancient Order of Hibernians here in St. Louis as well. So thank you so much. This year we're celebrating the 60th anniversary of UMSL, and some of us realize that the university is younger than we are, you know. But not everybody. And so part of our project of celebrating UMSL's 60th birthday is to invite some of our alumni back to give presentations. So a couple of weeks ago, the poet Sally Van Doren spoke for the English department, you know, reading from her new book of poems. And so our speaker today is Timothy White, is a 1982 political science graduate of UMSL. Just before I get things moving, the presentation today will be for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers afterwards. And just to update you on some forthcoming events, on December 1st, we will have a Christmas concert in the Toohill at 8 o'clock in the evening. It's our first ever Irish music and song Christmas concert. So the tickets are on sale, and if you would like to come, we would be delighted to have you there. And then on December 7th, also as part of our UMSL 60th, Kevin Buckley, a musician who's an UMSL graduate, Kevin is coming back to play a concert with Dan Lowry. That's at 12:30 on December 7th over in the Millennium Student Center. And here at UMSL Global, you know, one of the focal points of UMSL Global has been conflict resolution, and this has been done through the years with partnerships with in South Africa and in Northern Ireland. And this was an initiative of our Director Emeritus, Joel Glassman, which we were very grateful for, and has been ongoing. So today's event, the title of today's event is 25 Years After the Good Friday Agreement, a power transition in Northern Ireland's politics. And Timothy White is a 1982 political science grad from UMSL. And welcome home, Tim. We are proud of your success as a scholar, teacher, and author, and thank you for your support for UMSL Global over the years. Professor Tim White also earned his MA from Mizzou after he came here, and maybe the less we say about that, the better. And then he went on to the University of Michigan, where he got his PhD. And in the last 20 or 30 years, he's published extensively on aspects of foreign policy on Germany, Switzerland, Amsterdam, as well as on the north of Ireland. And he's edited volume Lessons from the Northern Ireland Peace Process is a kind of key book in the whole history of it. And so without further ado, then let me introduce you to Professor Tim White of Xavier University in Cincinnati.
Thank you very much. Great honor and privilege to be here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happened since 1998 and the Good Friday Agreement, but I'm not sure everybody's background, so I'm going to spend a little time talking about how the conflict developed, how we reached a peace agreement, and then talk at length about how things have changed since then and try to provide it into a historical perspective. This decade has been what Ireland calls the decade of centenaries. And by that, they mean it's the decade in which Ireland gained independence. And now we're in the first year of the Irish Civil War, when after independence, Irish people fought other Irish people about the merits of the treaty that brought some form of independence to 26 counties in Ireland. The next slide will show us that when Ireland gained its independence, based on the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, 6 counties in the northeast part of the country remained in the United Kingdom. So to provide an even further back sense of history, Ireland was basically colonized by the British. Irish people argue that for about 800 years, beginning back in 1169, 1170 is when the British first arrived with a guy named Strongbow who conquers the country. Gradually, the British kings gained greater and greater control over Ireland. And then over the centuries, Irish people tried to rebel for independence from the English as part of the United Kingdom. So 26 counties did gain that kind of independent status. It was called a free state. It technically wasn't a republic until the 1940s, when Ireland just declared itself a republic and the British said, okay, they didn't start a war over it or anything. But Northern Ireland has remained part of the United Kingdom as part of the treaty that was signed in 1921. When this territory gained its independence, the British built a nice parliament building, nice classical building called Stormont. It gets the name because it's the territory outside of Belfast where this is. So it'd be calling like a building Forest Park or something here in St. Louis. And Stormont is the building in Stormont. And this was built to be the legislature so that people in Northern Ireland could create their own laws and local policies. Now, when the British drew the boundaries in the early 1920s, they had census for every 10 years the previous 100 years. So they knew exactly where people lived. Most importantly, they knew where Protestants and Catholics in Ireland and Northern Ireland lived. So they drew the boundary in a kind of a weird shape. It's 250 miles long in a very small country, a zigzaggy pattern, and it's meant to maximize the number of Protestants that were in that territory. In 1922, census data showed there was 66% Protestant, okay? So they wanted to create a statelet that had an overwhelming Protestant population that would be loyal to the British Crown. And sure enough, those Protestants were. They identified as British. They wanted to remain in the United Kingdom. So for a good 40 to 50 years, the kind of system that was created here was called a Protestant government for a Protestant people. Every one of the leaders in the Northern Ireland governing system was Protestant. And if a Protestant politician had to build a road or a hospital or a school, they made sure that that tended to go more in the Protestant neighborhoods rather than the Catholic neighborhoods. Any Protestant politician that didn't deliver stuff to the Protestant population wouldn't get reelected. So you had a huge incentive as a Protestant politician in this system to create laws and policies that benefited the Protestant population. By definition, that meant a group that was the disadvantaged group. The Catholics felt grievances. They felt as they were treated second class within their own society. For 40 or 50 years, while there was a small presence of a group called the Irish Republican Army, they posed no serious threat to the British government or this political system. But in the 1960s, a group of Catholics, not inspired by the Catholic Church at all, by the way, but inspired instead by the US civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr., and to some extent, they were also heavily inspired by Gandhi's nonviolent strategy of gaining independence for India, started to peacefully parade and march, demanding equal rights in Northern Irish society. Well, these marches were not treated kindly by Protestants. They thought Catholics should know their place. They were second-class citizens. Stop complaining. So there was a escalation of tension between Protestants and Catholics, basically because the civil rights movement didn't achieve any of its objectives. No policies changed, no laws changed. So the more the Catholics marched and didn't get any results, they were frustrated, And the more their marches seemed to threaten the Protestant privileged ascendancy class that existed in Northern Ireland. These police force was called the Royal Ulster Constabulary. It was over 90% Protestant. It was extremely loyal to the crown. It saw these people as troublemakers that needed to be put down. And that's how the British government saw them as well. In 1969, tensions within Northern Ireland got to the point where the local police couldn't handle the kind of tension that was existing. So the British sent in their army units, okay? These were not trained in trying to divide Catholics and Protestants in peaceful ways. They were Welsh, English, Scottish people who, when they came to Northern Ireland, they didn't know what a Protestant looked like, what a Catholic looked like. They didn't understand the local terrain of what neighborhoods were Catholic, what were Protestant. They were put in a kind of an untenable position. Pretty quickly, Catholics, while initially hoping they would protect them, quickly realized they were just enforcing British law and the second-class citizenship that they felt and experienced. So they started throwing vegetables at them, things like that. The British gradually started using tear gas and other means to try to break up their marches. And tensions gradually rose until 1972, when the famous, 71 is when the British, after being so upset with all the marches, decide to throw a lot of people in jail, and they had no rights. They had no right to see an attorney, and they could be interrogated for literally years without ever having charges against them. So this would violate in America what we think is our Fourth Amendment protections for unreasonable searches and seizures and, being charged with a crime. This process escalated the civil rights marches. The British thought by finding the so-called 300 or 400 troublemakers and throwing them all in jail and not letting anybody visit them, that would put the riots down. Instead, that just escalated the violence. And then the British decided all marches were legal. Nobody could peacefully assemble in Northern Ireland, okay? And if you're Catholic, when you're told not to do that, your number one idea is, let's do it. Let's do even a bigger marches, right? So the marches got even bigger. And finally, in 1972, British paramilitary troops in the city of Derry, or Protestants called Londonderry, shot peaceful marchers. They killed 14, 27 more were sent to hospital seriously wounded. There was no evidence of Catholics using any deadly violence against these British soldiers. They might have been throwing tomatoes at them, or rocks. But to use physical force like this against the peaceful marchers kind of ended the era that Catholics believed they could protest peacefully and get anywhere. So the civil rights era ends, and what we call the Troubles escalate, where increasingly Catholics decide the only way we're going to get anywhere is to shoot at British soldiers, bomb Protestant pubs, establishments, in order to try to get noticed, create enough pain for them like we're experiencing that will allow us to achieve our rights. So the Troubles escalate throughout the 1970s. There are attempts at creating peace in this period. None of them succeed. Protestant paramilitaries are formed to try to fight the IRA and Catholic paramilitaries. There's some evidence at times that Protestant paramilitaries used intelligence gathered by the British in order to know who to attack and kill in Catholic communities. So these were, in a sense, from the Catholic perspective, especially a collusion of the British state with Protestant paramilitaries against the Catholic population, seeking change, seeking rights, and at this point, not just seeking to stay within the system, but to get the Brits out, to get rid of the British presence in Northern Ireland and unite Ireland as one free, independent republic. By the 1980s, the strategies of the British to deal with the Troubles changed a bit when Margaret Thatcher, a conservative, replaced Labour Party politicians who had been the prime minister throughout the 1970s or mid-70s. And she believed that the IRA were criminals. They were not a political organization. They should be treated as common criminals. So she tried to take away all of their political rights, as especially those who were imprisoned. They believed they were political prisoners. They should have been treated as such under the Geneva Accords that deal with how prisoners of war should be treated. She refused to allow them to wear their own clothes. She gave them prison uniforms. They refused to wear them. So if you don't wear your own clothes, you don't wear the prison clothes, you're naked. Okay, so they ran around naked and they became blanket men. They would wear the blankets that were on their beds to keep themselves from getting cold. They did lots of really nasty things to their cells to try to piss off the British and the local guards. This escalated ultimately to when in the early 1980s, the political party associated with the IRA, Sinn Fein, nominated a man to run for a vacant House of Commons seat in the British Parliament. His name was Bobby Sands. He was the first member of the IRA to go on a hunger strike. And as he was on his hunger strike, the seat in the British Parliament opened. Their system requires a quick replacement. They held a snap election. The IRA and Sinn Fein put his name in election. He actually won the seat to the British House of Commons as he was on hunger strike. This was big news. It got a lot of attention. Sinn Fein, the political party affiliated with the IRA, kind of learned from that experience that political power may not come just out of the end of a barrel of a gun or a bomb, but could come from democratic means of trying to gain representation. So the strategy moved from not just bullets, but bullets and ballots for the IRA and Sinn Fein beginning in the 1980s. In 1985, Thatcher signed an agreement which some see as a form of a peace agreement. It was an attempt to deal with the peace process. It was signed by the Irish Prime Minister in Ireland. It's called the Taoiseach, and Margaret Thatcher, and it was called the Anglo-Irish Agreement. This agreement just said that Ireland should be consulted about what the British government were doing in Northern Ireland. It wasn't a final peace. It only was negotiated between these two governments. It included no leaders of any party in Northern Ireland. Most of the parties of Northern Ireland went crazy when this was signed because they were excluded. And one of the things we learned from the failure of the Anglo-Irish Agreement was that any peace, if it was ever going to come to Northern Ireland, had to be inclusive. Everybody had to be invited to the table to negotiate. And you couldn't just have governments who weren't even in Northern Ireland making decisions about what should be the future of it. And the result of the failure of the Anglo-Irish Agreement to really end the Troubles in a dramatic way was highlighted by a famous bombing that happened in a town called Enniskillen on what the English or Northern Irish Protestants call Poppy Day or Remembrance Day. We call it Veterans Day. It's remembering those who served in World War I and World War II in the British Army. So it killed mostly old veterans from World War I and World War II. This was counterproductive for the IRA and Sinn Fein because it was seen as, why are you killing these old guys who fought in a war long ago? These aren't people who are identified today as in any way attacking Catholics, or they're the real enemy of what the IRA was trying to achieve in the near term. After that, a peace process gradually begins. At the beginning, it's secretive. This man, John Hume, was really the architect of the peace process. He had the vision of how it could be achieved. He realized he was a person committed to nonviolence. And he never supported, apologized, or in any way defended any IRA attack, killing any Protestant in Northern Ireland, killing any person in England, killing British soldiers. But he heavily condemned a lot of British policies. But he believed in the long run, all the parties had to come to negotiate, including Sinn Fein and the IRA. He's a Catholic politician representing, you could argue, sort of the peaceful group in Northern Ireland that wants Ireland to have a unification, but don't think violence is an appropriate means or strategy of achieving that. So he starts talking behind the scenes with the leaders of Sinn Fein. Remember, I argue in the early 80s, after the election of Bobby Sands, they learned that there may be a political strategy that goes beyond just bombing, maybe running people for office, and a traditional democratic political process can be a means of achieving their goals. So in the early 1990s, the Irish government becomes committed to the peace process under this leader named Albert Reynolds. He's a really interesting guy, and I think more should be written about Reynolds. His background is unique. He was a millionaire, and he made his money in dog food and dance halls. Not known for being, he's from the middle of the country in Longford, not known for being near the conflict or anything, but he became totally committed during his brief time as Taoiseach. And he understood all the different groups that he had to negotiate with. These included negotiating directly with Britain, and he had famous yelling conversations with the British Prime Minister John Major. He supported moderate nationalists like John Hume and worked closely with him. He would cajole Republicans and try to encourage Adams, McGuinness, leaders of Sinn Fein to commit to a ceasefire, stop using violence as a political strategy, and work closely with the Clinton White House once Clinton was elected as well. Excellent. His major achievement, and I think it's important in the narrative I'm going to try to emphasize at the end, was an agreement that was signed called the Downing Street Declaration. It was just a statement that the British Prime Minister made in front of his house, Downing Street in London. It was near Christmas time in 1993. But in this statement, the British government under Major made two important statements. They said first, that what happens in Northern Ireland should happen according to the principle of majority consent. So if the majority of people in Northern Ireland want to be in the United Kingdom, they should get to do that. If the majority of people in Northern Ireland want to be in the Republic of Ireland, they should get to do that. That peaceful democratic means should determine the political fate or the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. The second thing he said was that the British government had no selfish or strategic interest in Northern Ireland. Now this may, I don't know how people here would think, but in the early 20th century, people like Winston Churchill were obsessed that potential British enemies could use Ireland as some kind of strategic front to get into and attack England or the UK. This is a statement by the British government, like, look, if Northern Ireland leaves and it's no longer part of the UK, Britain will still exist, it will be okay. We don't hold on to the UK because we need it for security or because we can't have a United Kingdom without Northern Ireland. That was in a powerful statement that ended, you could argue, the British, at least colonial statement about their relationship with Ireland, in this case, Northern Ireland. Simultaneous to the emergence of all these other actions and the key a long-term peace process was that Adams and McGuinness, as leaders of Sinn Fein, came to the conclusion they could not defeat the British Army. Now, this may make obvious sense to us. A few guys with a little bit of syntax coming from Gaddafi is not going to defeat one of the largest militaries in the world, the British Army. But it took them a couple of decades to figure this out. And once they came to that conclusion, you could argue they were looking for a political way out, not a loss where they got nothing for decades of sacrifice. Many of their colleagues who had died on hunger strike, who had been attacked and killed, and tortured in British prisons. They wanted a diplomatic settlement, and they were sort of encouraged and promised this by Hume, by Reynolds, talk about by President Clinton. So they were able to convince the IRA to commit to a ceasefire in order that they could enter negotiations and a peace process. And President Clinton was important in this process because he gave a visa to Adams to come and visit the United States. The State Department had Adams on the terrorist watch list, which means we don't usually allow terrorists to come and travel in the United States. So he had to change his status, allow him to come over the objection, not just of the State Department, Secretary of State Warren Christopher at the time, but obviously John Major was not too happy about this as Prime Minister of Great Britain. They did not think this was a good idea either. But by legitimating Adams in this way, it encouraged Adams then to have the leverage to convince the IRA to stand down, at least to have a temporary ceasefire. Once the ceasefire happens, unfortunately, you can argue John Major makes a major strategic mistake. He says, we won't negotiate even after a ceasefire. They have to completely disarm. That was not realistic, that they were going to give up all their arms before negotiations even began. And the next thing that happens is an independent commission chaired by George Mitchell declares what needs to happen in order for people to enter the negotiations. And this basically said that you had to commit to a ceasefire and promise that you would see the result of the negotiations to be the end of all paramilitary activities. Not the immediate withdrawal of all arms, but you would see that the end result of a negotiated settlement would require that. And that allowed ultimately Sinn Fein to enter the negotiations. Before this was allowed to happen, unfortunately, the IRA ended their first ceasefire, went back to bombing, and this was their most famous explosion at the Canary Wharf in early 1996. Soon thereafter, John Major loses the election in 1997 to Tony Blair. He's the new leader of the new Labour Party coming into power in the UK. And he has a policy he advocates called devolution, giving more autonomy and power to the local Celtic periphery, basically, of the UK, including Northern Ireland. So he sees a peace process in Northern Ireland as a key part of his overall political strategy for the UK. In the same year, the Irish elect a new Taoiseach or prime minister named Bertie Ahern, who is willing in the negotiation process to rescind Ireland's claim to jurisdiction over all of the island. The 1937 Irish Constitution had said that Ireland controls the whole island. That was empirically false. They didn't control the Northeast 6 counties, but they wanted to claim that. He was willing to rescind those articles in elements of Articles 2 and 3 in the Irish Constitution in order to pursue a peace for Northern Ireland. Ultimately, after some more negotiations, some long drawn out processes, we get an agreement on Good Friday of 1998 in April. Catholics tend to call this agreement the Good Friday Agreement. Protestants call it Belfast Agreement. It's the same agreement, but they can't even agree on the name of what the agreement is. But there were 3 important strands or sets of relationships that the agreement dealt with. It created a new assembly that required power sharing between nationalists and unionists, Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. It created a North-South ministerial councils where ministers of the Northern Ireland government would meet monthly with ministers from the Southern Ireland government in order to coordinate maritime policies, tourism, agriculture, healthcare, other issues. And there'd be a Council of the Isles, which would link all of the islands off of Britain, Ireland, into every 6 months having meetings to talk about common issues facing all of the islands off of the west coast of the continent of Europe. The agreement was ultimately ratified in in 2 referenda, one held in the Republic, one held in Northern Ireland. And that gave democratic legitimacy to a negotiated settlement made primarily by political elites who negotiated behind the scenes and only told their constituents what they were doing as developments occurred within the negotiating process. And the 2 men between, on the other side of Bono has to be there, but David Trimble on the left was leader of the largest Protestant party, the Ulster Unionist Party. John Hume, the leader of the SDLP, Social Democratic and Labour Party, won the 1998 Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts in negotiating this agreement. So the agreement, you'd think, okay, we have peace. Well, one of the problems of understanding how peace processes and conflict resolution works is to think that once you achieve peace, it's all, wonderful. Well, the reality was the peace agreement created institutional mechanisms, but it required all sides to continue to work in good faith with each other, to try to achieve some level of reconciliation among people who had been very recently hostile to the point of killing, bombing each other. So this was a long-term process of peace building after an agreement was reached. And clearly not everybody agreed, even though about 70% of people in Northern Ireland, not over 90% of people in the Republic of Ireland agreed in the referendum to support the agreement. There were people who opposed it, including some extremists in the Republican or Catholic community, who most famously bombed in the worst killing incident of the entire era of the Troubles, 2 months after the referendum were approved, a bombing in a town called Omagh in Northern Ireland. 29 people were killed, 360 were injured in this bombing. And it was in the middle of a city that is equally Catholic and Protestant. So the number of deaths was almost exactly equal between both sides. So in some ways it seemed indiscriminate and just causing total mayhem to both communities or to all elements. And some of the deaths included Spanish tourists even, who were just visiting Omagh for the day. There was also political opposition that continued among Protestants. Exit polls showed that only 51% of Protestants in the referenda voted in favor of the agreement. So there was a big divide between Catholic and Protestant support for the Good Friday Agreement from the beginning. And one political party called the Democratic Unionist Party opposed the agreement. They didn't negotiate the agreement. Their leader, Ian Paisley, famously walked out of the negotiation, said he wouldn't negotiate with Sinn Fein and terrorists. And they opposed it then. And he famously said, no, no, never. That was his famous motto. He had opposed every peace agreement ever. Agreements in the 1970s, 1980s, and now in the 1990s. So his nickname was Dr. No. After the agreement was signed, there were issues that weren't resolved, especially decommissioning of weapons. Even though parties said they would try to get rid of all the terrorist weaponry that existed, it didn't happen. The IRA especially proved reluctant to get rid of their weapons as fast as Protestant leaders like Trimble, who had signed the agreement and understood that the IRA would completely disarm. When they didn't do so, he said, we're not playing the game anymore. So he left, and the institutions created in 1998 collapsed in 2002. And they were not functioning. Nobody went to Stormont. There was no elections. There was no political governance going on after 2005 in Northern Ireland for 4.5 years. In 2006, in October, Blair and Ahern, still in power, and this is an interesting thing to note, the two leaders who had led the British and Irish governments in 1998 were still around 8 years later to try to get heads together and try to get a new agreement called the St. Andrews Agreement that would allow the parties to basically continue on. In the meantime, the more extreme parties had become more popular. So the more moderate parties and their leaders, who I showed you holding hands with Bono, they lost. Their parties got less popular. The more radical or extreme parties come to power. How do you get the more extremes to share power becomes a very difficult question. So they cajoled, pushed, gave incentives, in some ways politically threatened, and ultimately, by the spring of 2007, the leaders of the two parties in Northern Ireland on the extremes finally agreed to share power. And it creates the longest period of political stability since the Good Friday Agreement. For about really close to 10 years, we had stable governance where the leader of the DUP, at first Paisley, he's in his early 80s, so he resigned only a couple years after this. But his successors share power with Martin McGuinness, longtime leader of Sinn Fein, and a confessed person. He confessed early in his life to be the commander of the IRA in Derry. He said he left the IRA as an organization. Not everybody agreed exactly with how he said that, but he had affiliation, obviously, as one of the sort of the military strongmen within the Republican tradition in Northern Ireland. So Paisley and McGuinness famously share power, and this picture is called throughout Ireland and the UK, the Chuckles brothers pictures. They actually became quite good friends. McGuinness came to my university twice and talked in very affectionate terms about Ian Paisley, a person who wouldn't shake his hand, wouldn't talk to him for his first 80-something years of his life. But they came practically to see that they could work together to achieve common goals for all the people of Northern Ireland. So this was the golden era of power sharing in Northern Ireland. There were brief blips along the way. For example, in 2015, a police report suggested that there still was an IRA, which was supposed to not exist anymore. So the Protestant leaders at the time, Peter Robinson, who had succeeded Paisley, said, but we can't continue in government with groups that are still using violence. We cannot do that. So they had emergency negotiations and they got past the blip, agreed to share power, and it continued on. So there was some issues along the way. I don't want to act like nothing happened after 2007. But this was the biggest challenge, and it was overcome quite quickly among Northern Ireland. The biggest threat to the peace process and how the Good Friday Agreement was implemented became Brexit, and not because of its direct role, but because of its after effects. When the UK citizenry voted in 2016 in June, 52-48 in favor of leaving the European Union, it created a hard border in Ireland, or at least the potential for a hard border in Ireland that hadn't existed since both the UK and the EU UK and Ireland had joined the EU back in the early 70s. Now this border that was in Ireland. Ireland remained in the EU. Northern Ireland wasn't as part of the UK. Meant that all trade that had developed across this 250-mile border now had to be regulated as entering or leaving the EU and leaving the UK. This proved politically problematic. And there were other issues that emerged that eventually challenged the logic of sharing power within Northern Ireland. Primarily a scandal that was called the Cash for Ash scandal. There was a scheme to promote heating renewal and energy conservation, in which it was clear monies were going in huge amounts to the political allies of Arlene Foster and the DUP. She succeeded Peter Robinson as leader of the DUP. She refused to allow for any investigation. She was never personally associated with it, but clearly some of her chief political allies and operatives were. Her refusal to agree to step aside, at least temporarily, led Martin McGuinness, who had shared power with all these leaders, to say we can't continue on into power sharing with somebody who's so publicly accused of scandal. So he withdrew from the Northern Ireland Executive in 2017, January. Next slide. He was replaced by Michelle O'Neill, not because it's just cash for ash. McGuinness was very ill at the time. He suffered from some kind of genetic disorder that only people from Donegal have. It's a genetic issue. So he was really within 2 months of dying. So he was replaced by Michelle O'Neill. So she became the leader of Sinn Fein in Northern Ireland, has been so for the last 6 years since then. One of the challenges after Brexit wasn't just what Brexit itself did, but what British prime ministers who tried to execute Brexit said, did, and how that led to all kinds of problems among different parties in Northern Ireland. Theresa May, you could argue, tried a sincere effort to try to find some wiggle room where she would satisfy unionist demands in Northern Ireland to remain in the UK, but not create a hard border, which would create huge political problems among Republicans and nationalists. Boris Johnson, as a fellow member of her party, he and others refused to agree to the agreement she had. So eventually she resigned. Johnson replaces her, calls a flash election where he gets a huge majority in the House of Commons, and he pushes through something called the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was part of the withdrawal agreement that he agrees to with the EU. This clearly creates a system where Northern Ireland is treated differently than the rest of the UK, Scotland, Wales, and England, which angers unionists who feel as if they've been betrayed by the British government. He leaves ultimately not just because of this issue, but for other domestic issues within the British system, temporarily placed very briefly by Liz Truss, who really doesn't do anything regarding Northern Ireland. She gets in other budgetary issues and problems. She leaves, and she's replaced by Rishi Sunak. So there's a whole slew of British leaders who offer different ideas, opinions, don't offer consistency, they don't have experience, and they seem not the best. And I would say, to be fair, I think Sunak has done a better job of being sincere and not as openly two-faced, especially as Boris Johnson was in the process of negotiating with different parties regarding how the UK would leave the EU and its impact on Northern Ireland. In early 2020, Julian Smith, who was immediately fired after this, as Secretary of State of Northern Ireland, was able to work with the Irish Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney, at the time, to create a new power sharing arrangement. So for 3 years, from January of 2017 to January 2020, there was no power sharing in Northern Ireland. The agreement wasn't working. They get it to seemingly get restarted. And at this point, Arlene Foster again agrees to share power as First Minister with Michelle O'Neill. So we have a restoration of the Northern Ireland Assembly and power sharing as it was envisioned by the Good Friday Agreement. Soon thereafter, there's more political turmoil within this Democratic Unionist Party. Foster is sacked because she's seen as not being hard enough defending the rights of unionists to the British government, to the Irish government, to the EU. So she's replaced by Edwin Putz. He lasts 1 month. They see him as too weak. They replace him, and he's replaced by, next slide, the current leader, Jeffrey Donaldson. Now, if the previous two leaders of your party got in trouble for not being hard enough with the British and not standing up for unionist rights, do you think he has a near-term incentive of caving to any kind of reasonable compromise, right? And there was a poll just taken, it came out yesterday in the Belfast Telegraph. Of his constituents, 68% are not for any compromise. So if you know your voters are 68% against any compromise, are you gonna power share with him? No way. So he's in a position politically where if he would make what would be seen as a reasonable political compromise, he will lose his position because another member of his party will say, you weren't loyal, you didn't fight for our cause, so he'll be gone. So Donaldson plays this tricky thing, and he has a history. When the Good Friday Agreement was being negotiated, he was a member of Trimble's party, the UUP. He left and joined Paisley's party, the DUP, because he didn't like the Good Friday Agreement. So his long-term suspicions are decades old of the idea of power sharing with Catholics in Northern Ireland. To kind of cement the problems of power sharing in recent years, the current system in Northern Ireland doesn't allow a politician to be a member of the British Parliament and a member of the Northern Irish Assembly simultaneously. So Donaldson's the leader of the party, but he sits in the British House of Commons. This man sits in the Northern Ireland Assembly, so he's the DUP leader in that assembly. He resigned as first minister in early 2022, more than a year and a half ago now, because of the DUP's anger over the Northern Ireland Protocol that Boris Johnson had negotiated and refused. We're not going to participate until that's gone. You have to renegotiate the whole withdrawal agreement of the British withdrawing from the EU, as far as they're concerned. Further problems for the DUP happened in the most recent assembly elections. These are about 15 months ago now, 16 months ago, where before this election, the DUP had 29 seats. They lost 4 seats in this last election. They only have 25 seats. Sinn Fein has 27 seats. So how the system works is the leader of the largest party gets to be first minister. The leader of the second largest party, or the party from the opposite community, gets to be deputy first minister. In every election since the Good Friday Agreement, the leader of a Protestant party has been first minister, and the Catholics have been deputies. Now, if this would be operationalized, Sinn Fein would be first minister, and they would have to be deputy first minister. For people who are used to having all the power, most of the power, accepting being second to Sinn Fein, it's cause for nightmares. And the other parties are, you can see here, but there's no clear majority party in their system. It's very blocked. The Alliance Party is a party that tries to be middle between the two communities, but it's really a liberal Protestant party. Almost all of its members are Protestants. So the last thing I wanted to do is try to historicize this long track of all these developments that have occurred in the Troubles, the peace agreement, and especially what's happened afterward. And when I was thinking about this, and I titled the talk, A Power Transition, I thought back to a man I studied under when I was getting my PhD at the University of Michigan. His name was A.F.K. Organsky. And Organsky had a relatively simple theory. A lot of political scientists and other social scientists come up with very advanced theories, very sophisticated. His theory of power transition was quite simple. It basically tries to explain how great powers rise and fall over time. Who are the great powers in the system, and how this rising and falling of states can cause wars, cause political violence in the world. So what are the central assumptions of this theory? Well, basically, differential rates of economic growth determine the rise and fall of states. So if one state has a stalled economy, it's losing out in new technologies to a new state who's growing very rapidly, they replace the old great power, okay? So we've seen throughout history, obviously, great powers rise and fall. His theory was trying to explain that. And ultimately, we get new powers who surpass the old great power when that old power declines, right? And there's been studies of this going back to the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. The power transition makes war possible when a great power sees the rising power or group coming and decides, you know, if we don't take them out now, they're going to get us. So let's wipe them out or whittle them down so that we get to maintain our power, our advantage in the system. Or the challenging power could initiate war because they're not satisfied with being appeased by the old great power, who's reluctant to share power, give them power, etc. So I'm going to try to briefly explain how this theory can be applied to a historical context. Last slide. Gotta go back. So how do you apply this to Northern Ireland? Clearly, if we start from the beginning, Protestants were clearly the dominant group in Northern Ireland. I don't think there's any political debate about that. Even unionists who want to say the union was fair would say, well, we won every time, right? We were always the prime minister. We had better houses. We got to go to better schools. We lived longer lives as we had better healthcare. All the system benefited them. And it was linked to being the preferred system within the British Empire, right? If Ireland was colonized by the British and the long-term British project was to make the subjects of Ireland English, then those who preferred the United Kingdom would be preferred citizens by the British. It makes perfect sense in their perspective. But clearly the power of the British Empire has faded in the last century as well. In 1922, the British would have seen themselves as still having an empire, right? They still controlled India. They had colonies all over Africa. Today, that empire is gone, and not many people see the United Kingdom as a rising power. Like, do you hear a debate about the UK defeating China as the next great power? Right? Or the UK surpassing Germany is the next great power in Europe? Not so often, right? So not only is the colonizing power fading, but the advantage of that group is fading over time. And it's not just economics. Organsky's, one of his big books was he called Births, Deaths, and Taxes. He spent a lot of time studying demography, population, right? Some groups rise and fall in terms of their population. I said when Northern Ireland came into existence, 2/3 of the population was Protestant. Today, that's 58% at the most. If you go to any university in Northern Ireland, it's over 60% Catholic. The long-term trajectory of the population of the country is clearly increasingly Catholic. Not only that, if you do surveys and you ask people who you identify with, the number of people who identify with unionists is less than half. And it's especially low among young Protestants who, I would argue, have a sense of identity which is quite distinct from what Protestantism was 100 years ago. And the social organizations like the Orange Order and others that so organized Protestant life for previous generations just don't seem to be 21st century for a young Protestant being raised in Belfast or any of the smaller towns and areas of Northern Ireland today. So given their historic economic decline to some extent as part of the imperial system, as well as the demographic decline, Catholics have an opposite narrative. The Good Friday Agreement meant they went from being second-class citizens to what the agreement called a parity of esteem. Both traditions have a parity of esteem, right? Parity means equal. If you're equal, you're no longer second rate. You're no longer second class. So the Good Friday Agreement to me is a part of a trajectory of Protestants' privilege giving way to equality, at least the norm of equality. But it's also a decline, because if you went from having most or all the power to only half or sharing power, that's not as much. And the continued difficulty of Protestants dealing with the after effects of Brexit has created an opportunity for Catholics to increasingly assert a narrative of unification, which historically existed. You know, we've done surveys in Ireland since the 1940s, and almost every Irish person says, would it be a good idea if Ireland was united? Oh yeah. When do you think that'll happen? People always said, not in my lifetime. It was somewhere far in the distance. Now there's all kinds of meetings, and the Irish government is spending actual money trying to create up a narrative, policies of how they can create what they call a shared future, an inclusive Ireland that would be united, in which the Protestant minority that would exist in the northeast part of the country would feel respected, would feel they have rights, and not threatened. But for them, to be a minority when they historically were the majority and when they had privilege and power. And now the only hope they would have would be to be a coalition partner with some party from the Catholic population in the south of Ireland, probably, is hard for them to take. And it plays upon what many scholars have called the siege mentality that has existed among Protestants in Ireland since they came from Scotland in the 17th century. And the difficulty in the future of Ireland is how to negotiate the sort of long-term historical factors which are favoring the rise of Catholic power, unification, and how that plays against the interest of those who historically were privileged and who now feel threatened, the loss of that power, and how it's been decreasing over the past 25 years in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement. I think I've talked my 45 minutes plus, so I'll be quiet. Thank you for your attention.
We let Tim just have a drink of water and then he will answer any questions. Just raise your hand and Tim will answer the question.
For many years, the Good Friday Agreement and the apparent resolution of the Irish Irish problem, to many people seem to offer some lessons that could be applied to other seemingly intractable conflicts, such as in the Middle East. Today, does anyone talk about still how, even though the Irish experience, as you suggested, is still unfinished and there's still some issues, are there still any lessons that can be learned from the Irish experience that can be applied to the current, Middle East situation?
Well, and I'm going to look at this from, you go to, especially to Northern Ireland, but in the Republic as well, there's an enormous amount of sympathy Irish people have for Palestinians. And there may be lots of potential motivations for that. I'm not going to say I'm ascribing to everything, but some of this dates back to long before the Good Friday Agreement. The IRA historically identified with what they saw as people who were similarly downtrodden and beaten out in the colonization process, and to the extent to which they saw Palestinians losing out to Israelis or the British under the previous system in the Middle East, they would identify with them. So that was partially it. I think the biggest lesson, and it's the hardest lesson, but it requires long-term strategic thinking, is that you don't make peace with your friends. You're already at peace with your friends. You make peace with your enemies. Right? I mean, Tony Blair used to say, if the Protestants and Catholics could have worked this out, they already would have. It required a very inclusive set of actors. There's increasing scholarship on how the EU played a role, for example, in Northern Ireland as an international organization, supporting through all kinds of economic aid, peace programs that were put in, diplomatic adventures. Hume clearly tried to use his influence within the European Parliament to try to get the EU to do things to help, as he perceived, the peace process, maybe his side of the peace process, but still the peace process. So I would say generally the biggest lesson that came out of Northern Ireland, if you look at the earlier efforts that failed, like the Anglo-Irish Agreement, is you got to get all the parties at the table, even people you don't like. Now, you may have to create kind of funny situations where some people haven't really gotten rid of all their arms, who are the terrorist groups or the paramilitaries, right? The IRA was allowed, in a sense, to be politically represented in the Good Friday negotiations when they still held arms, but when they had declared a ceasefire and lived by it for a while. And they had to go a few months without blowing anything up. And the British agreed with that. That was an internationally accepted process. They did have to also commit that in the peace process, they would be willing to give up their arms in order to, if they were satisfied with the negotiation process and the outcome. So I think inclusiveness, and that's really hard in a process where the violence has escalated. I mean, one of the things that had happened by the 90s, there was a sense of exhaustion in Northern Ireland. So the number of deaths had declined pretty significantly year by year from the late 80s into the 90s. When there are fresh bombings and explosions, it's much harder to enter negotiations, right? So in my opinion, if you want to compare the Middle East peace process, I would argue, and I don't want to blame, but there's been a lot of time since the Camp David Accord. And not great progress after. So we had Oslo, we had other things, but the momentum for trying to create a solution in which all the parties, not just the Palestinian Israelis, but the regional actors would have all agreed to that. It would have been nice to have that happen, right? I mean, and that may not have good. The Irish were lucky in that I think they had people who were willing to cut deals, like Trimble as the leader of the Protestants. He knew a lot of people would disagree with him, but he thought, and I think he was quite reasonable, like if power sharing would work, it's the best way to guarantee themselves. If we're the majority and democracy is the norm, the only way this place can change is if majority would vote against us. Why can't we accept that norm, right? And we'd end the violence, right? And that was a huge achievement. I think it was just announced this week that a statue of Trimble is now going up in the Irish Parliament, which I'm not sure is in his interest as a unionist politician in Northern Ireland to have that legacy, to have your statue in the Irish Parliament. But I think people recognize the political courage it took for him to concede, to make a deal. Whereas I said, it was built on a parity of esteem, sharing power, which was hard for a group who had decades of being in the privileged position of having power. Yeah.
It sometimes seems to me that the DUP is far more annoyed with London than they are with Dublin.
To some extent, that's true.
And does that kind of economic pressure especially with respect to what the young folks see as the future of the North?
Yeah, and the British government's gotten less interested in subsidizing Northern Ireland. Their health system is rapidly decaying. I think the Irish government is sending nurses to Northern Ireland to help. Economically, it's clear that the Republic of Ireland is way better off than the North. And that's not all just due to domestic things in Northern Ireland. I mean, part of it's the unique situation where so many multinationals have invested in the Republic and they haven't gone to the North, and then that's hurt them in a comparative context. The British government's clearly, I mean, I think Johnson was he was bad on all sides. Like he would say one thing to one group, it would be in the press, and he'd go and say something the direct opposite. The people, and the irony was that 55% of people in Northern Ireland voted against Brexit, right? But 45% voted for it. They're almost all DUP people, okay? So they voted for something, which in the end is really destroying the status that they had. Like I'm not saying the Good Friday Agreement and those institutions would have lasted forever, but they were working relatively well in the last 10 years before that, before the Brexit vote. And Brexit just undermined the sense and led to, I think, justifiable insecurity that the British government doesn't have their back. And in a sense, if you go back to the Downing Street Declaration, well, I admire it in some ways. If you're a unionist, well, the British government doesn't have a self-interest in us staying in the union. How loyal should we be to them if they're not really loyal to us, right? But they feel so British. And the long-term demography is based primarily on Protestant kids when they go to university in England or Scotland. Like in any part of the world, if you kind of go to college there, you might stay there. If you see yourself as British, maybe going to school in Reading and living in Reading, maybe just as nice as living in Belfast, right? It suits your identity, right? And that's, I think, a big challenge. And I think the DUP, it's sort of hard-edged politics has alienated younger voters, and the organizations, especially Orange Order, just isn't attracting young Protestants the way it did in previous eras. So the socialization of identifying with this sort of Protestant culture of unionist hegemony in Northern Ireland is being undermined internally, while Catholic assertiveness, I think, of their own identity of an ultimate united Ireland is more dominant than ever before. Go ahead.
I was in Ireland about a month ago, And I took a tour in Derry and I took a tour in Belfast. The one in Derry was given by somebody who grew up in Derry Catholic, and the one in Belfast was somebody who grew up in Belfast Protestant.
Okay.
And in Derry, our tour guide mentioned that part of the agreement was that Northern Ireland could go back to Ireland if the majority agreed on it, which I think you mentioned.
Yeah.
And she also mentioned that back when the Protestants kind of had the power, they used gerrymandering to make sure that Catholics wouldn't get a vote. Like they would say, you have to own a house to vote, and then they just wouldn't give them houses, essentially.
Yeah.
So do you think that they always kind of had the power, but just were?
Well, from the 1920s to the 1960s, it's an empirical fact. Protestants had the power. I mean, it was always a Protestant leader, and they made policies. It would be, it's not that different in any other country's politics. If you represent, let's say, city of St. Louis and rural Missouri, but more of your voters are from rural Missouri, you're going to spend more time on an agricultural committee making sure that farmers in your constituents get more farm aid, right? And you're going to worry less about city or urban redevelopment or something that the government might provide for you. It's just the nature of the beast, because literally, if you didn't do that, there would be another guy who would run and say, this guy's not giving you enough. You elect me, I'll get you a better school, better roads, the better privilege that you deserve as a Protestant.
So I guess my question is, now that Sinn Fein has more seats, like our tour guide in Derry said that she thought that Northern Ireland would go back to Ireland in her lifetime, which is funny because I know you mentioned that a lot of people would say the opposite.
That's changed.
Yeah.
Since
Do you-
Brexit.
Do you agree with that, or do you?
Well,
Because the
depends what
guy.
age you are. I'm old enough. I think for somebody who's 20, I would think in the next 20 or 30 years it will happen. But I think for peace, it needs to be thought out a little bit.
Yeah, our Protestant tour guide said that he thought that some Protestants, especially the Orange Order, would be willing to take up arms, which was a little.
And other people like Arlene Foster has said, if unification ever comes, she's leaving. She's just moving to England, right? And that will happen, but there are ways in which a negotiated process could say, for example, right now, if you're born in Northern Ireland, you have a right to be an Irish citizen or a British citizen. You could hold either or both passports. There could be a policy of saying you're allowed, if you're a Protestant Northern Ireland, you feel British, negotiate with the British government. Can this person who's now born, if it's a United Ireland in the Republic, still carry a British passport? And why? Maybe a legacy of your parents or, the family you grew up in, the neighborhood. I think if you look at the overall population, Unionists in Northern Ireland would make up about 20% of the United Ireland's population. Given how fractured parties are in the Republic of Ireland, that could be a coalition partner, in a majority parliament government. So I wouldn't, in the long run, I wouldn't dismiss it. One of the things that makes Protestants in the North fearful is that when the rest of Ireland gained independence, 10% of those 26 counties were Protestant in 1922. By 1970, it fell to 3%. Maybe this kind of left. There was a policy when Catholics married Protestants, the Protestant had to convert to Catholicism, basically. So there was a process of that doesn't bode well for your tradition if it kind of disappears. Now today it's actually surprisingly reemerged. I think 10% now, the last Irish census identify as Protestant. So it's kind of gone back up again in the last 30 years. And then of Catholics has dramatically declined. So,
In talking to my relatives in Ireland, the older people were of the mind that the Catholic Church is losing power among the Irish, and my younger relatives were all for it. They thought it was a good deal. And in years past, one of the objections the Protestants had from Northern Ireland is they didn't want Rome rule. And do you think that decrease in power by the Catholic Church has been a good thing in terms of unification or not?
Well, I think among older unionists, they would still think that way, but the empirical reality is that that's definitely not true. I mean, the Irish Prime Minister today he's a gay Indian. You know, the idea that Ireland, Catholicism in Ireland, the crash has been just incredible. And there's no end in sight. Like I remember when I started doing conservative research, 90% of people in 1990 went to weekly mass. That's down to like 20%. And I think below 30, it's less than 2%. Like it's the long-term decline of church attendance. And it's not just church attendance. If you ask Irish people, do they respect a priest? Oh my gosh, like, because there's ongoing scandal. Like I think in the last month, we've learned that there's some 90-something-year-old Christian brother that they've been hiding so he doesn't have to go to prison. You know, it just goes on and on and on. And I think we're gonna have to get a generation or two past the era of clerical sex abuse for any hope for revival, any kind of Catholic power in Ireland.
All right, we just have maybe time for one more question. Kay, go ahead.
It piggybacks on what you were saying, is that all of this, whether it's here or the Middle East or wherever you talk about historically, conflict has often been tied very heavily with religion. And as the younger generations are saying, that's not really how I identify myself. And also being in Ireland and married to an Irishman who was raised, of course, in the 60s as a Catholic, has nothing to do with the church. And many of our relatives in Ireland, though they still have a priest at a funeral and you still do all that, they don't attend.
Yeah.
They're not married, but they're raising families. And so is it possible if we get to a point, people say, well, I grew up Catholic, so I'm always a Catholic. Or I grew up as a Christian. If you do not worship, if you do not adhere to those religions,
But how many Catholics were listening to the church when they condemned the violence of the IRA? You know, if you're gonna argue the Catholic Church was powerful in the 1960s and 70s.
Oh, I know it was powerful.
What I'm saying, how could it be powerful at the same time its adherents do all kinds of terrible acts of violence that the bishops and priests were condemning? So I have a friend who teaches at Ohio U, and she argues that she's done a lot of work in Belfast, and she argues that Catholic and Protestant faiths are all powerful. And I argue there's too many leaders, too few followers. I don't think people because there was a consistent ethic from all the Protestant leaders, the Catholic leaders throughout the Troubles, that violence was unacceptable. And it just kept on going and got worse. So if you're going to argue the Catholic Church was powerful, I think maybe it was powerful in the sense that people did attend religious services. But in the end, these are political issues. The religious teachings of the churches probably didn't have much to do with what was happening, because the adherents weren't following what the leaders were saying. There was really even Paisley, who founded his own religion, tried to argue he was against violence. Now, he egged on violence, but he didn't, as far as we know, go out and say, let's go get some bombs and blow Catholics up. But he taught hate, that's clear, but he didn't actually say, let's act on that hate by going up and blowing up Catholics. But the Methodist, the Church of Ireland, the Roman Catholic leaders were united. And there was a famous meeting at Fecal in County Clare in 1973 where they all came together and tried to convince the IRA to stop. It had no effect whatsoever. So it's an interesting concept, the idea that the church was all powerful.
I'm not saying the church, I'm saying how people identify.
I know, but if you identify with something and their leaders in the church is a hierarchical organization, they didn't have the effect that the church leaders wanted of stopping it.
Well, I guess it was, that's where if you identify with how you raised, but you don't go to church, you don't listen to church leaders, how does that not skew some of these arguments?
Yeah, and then that's one of the questions is, in a society that was what some scholars call monopoly of religion, south of Ireland, Catholicism was the only game in town. When the monopoly is gone, which it kind of is now, what is the basis of the moral order? That's an interesting question, but I think it's mostly individually formed consciousness of people's own expectations about what they think is right or wrong these days. That's what causes behavior. But, you know, the social values of Irish people are quite liberal, I think, in the international context these days. So, yeah, more so than America, absolutely. You know, if you look at attitudes towards, you know, homosexuality, gay marriage, et cetera, I think they'd be far different than the States.
Okay, I mean, I think we could have a great, you know, we could have a debate between the two of you. I don't know. It would be very good.
You know where I stand.
I know where you're standing. Kay is one of, is a retired professor and a veteran of our study abroad program in Galway, you know, so, we've reached the end of the time, and, just before I make a final, thank you to, Professor White, just to mention our Seamus Egan concert on December 1st, and then we have our Kevin Buckley and Dan Lowry on December 7th here on campus. Also, just a reminder, if you want to take one of these flyers before you leave, we're doing an Irish American past, present, and future symposium on the 3rd and 4th of May. We're sponsoring it with other organizations, including the Ancient Order of Hibernians here in St. Louis. So if you want some information on this, it'll be a kind of an exciting day and a half of a symposium. But enough of that. So it was great to welcome back Professor Tim White here today, and it's wonderful that one of his teachers, Professor Rochester, was here to hear.
Absolutely.